Thank you very much, Sophie and Duncan, and thank you all for your warm welcome to the Diocese of Durham. It's wonderful. I feel like I have a privileged insight into what you're doing together as a diocese at this time. So thank you so much for your invitation. I'm looking forward to journeying, pilgriming with you, if that's even a word, over the next few days. So let me ask you some questions. What does success look like in your world? How will you know if you have been successful? And would you call yourself ambitious? Now, why do those questions make you feel, I expect, somewhat uncomfortable? Why does it feel a little bit as though I'm swearing at you using such words in a Christian context? Ambition and success are things that we don't often hear church people talk about. Other people are ambitious, of course, sinful, worldly people, but not us. Shameless plug. I've written a book out in the 21st of November, available from all good local Christian booksellers, Ambition. What Jesus said about power, growth, success, and counting stuff. And I wrote that book because as a church at the moment, we seem to be fairly obsessed with being successful. Except we don't call it that, of course, we call it growth. And all of that is really good. Can I just say at the start, I am delighted that the number one priority that you have in this diocese is growth. And I will explain why in a moment. I want to see every child, woman and man in this country having a chance to hear and respond to the good news of Jesus and become a member of his family in the church. I love that the Archbishop of Canterbury has witness as one of his key priorities, and he speaks of his confidence to see a growing church. I love it that Bishop Paul spoke about growth at the start of our time together this morning. I want to see the church grow in discipleship, in holiness, in influence in society, and in numbers. I do happen to think that it is about bums on pews. We must rejoice as people come into God's kingdom one by one by one. And yet, I've been around church for long enough to know that it's not straightforward. The context is tough. Evangelism is difficult. Growing a church numerically is really difficult, especially in rural Cumbria, especially in the ex-mining towns of Durham. And as a bishop and the wife of a vicar, I've seen the effect that that constant pressure to grow can have on our souls. And these kinds of questions are not exclusive to the church. We live in a culture, don't we, where we value tracking, counting, analysing, measuring growth, target setting, comparative benchmarks, the inexorable quest for improvement, all find expression in business, in healthcare, in politics, in education, and in the public sector. There will not be a leader in this room, in whatever sphere, who has escaped the constant drive to measure everything, to plot it on graphs, to track performance year on year. And if you're a child or a young person at school, you will have target grades and expected grades, and your progress will be tracked term by term. The Church of England has a whole department dedicated to gathering statistics and plotting it in lovely coloured graphs. And we're being held accountable for the numbers, and that is good. But I've been asking myself some questions. How do we measure success as Christians in whatever sphere we live and move and have our being? How do we encourage the right kind of ambition? After all, both words, ambition and success, are fairly neutral in their origin. The English word ambition, and this is where some of your Latin classes at school might come into play, simply comes from the word to walk. Ambulare, to walk. Its roots are found in ancient Rome as politicians walked around the city to canvass for votes. And so, in a conference called Waymark, about to launch a pilgrim year, you are right on message. Well done. Success comes from the Latin to follow after. I love G.K. Chesterton's response to being asked to provide an endorsement for a book on success. Yes, apparently such things have been around for a while. And he said this: to begin with, of course, there is no such thing as success. Or if you like to put it so, there is nothing that is not successful. That a thing is successful merely means that it is. A millionaire is successful at being a millionaire, a donkey in being a donkey. So both words, success and ambition, are fairly neutral, at least in their origins. And I hope that we can redeem and recover both words for the gospel. Christians have God-given gifts and ambitions that Jesus wants to put into use for building his kingdom. After all, the Bible is full of ambition. What was God's command to Adam and Eve? To have dominion over the earth, except a kind of ambition, the limits of which were set by God himself. You can eat anything, but not that one tree in the middle of the garden. And tempted by the serpent, who tells them that their own sense-led sense of ambition isn't off limits, and if they eat, they will just become like God, they go ahead and eat. And ever since, I think humans have taken that God-given gift of ambition and used it to achieve their own desires and purposes. I wonder if you've ever asked this question: was Jesus ambitious? Well, I think he was, if by that you mean that he put his everything into fulfilling the will of his Father. But most of the time, he seemed to delight in doing things that you don't learn in How to Win Friends and Influence People seminars. He wasn't very good at networking. He hung out with the wrong people, and they gave him a bad reputation. And after he had successfully fed 5,000 people, did he stay around so that everybody could tell him well done? No, he ran away up a mountain. And he wasn't very good at saying the right things. When he got a bit of customer feedback that his teaching was just a bit too difficult, did he modify his language as a result? Nope. There are two words used for ambition in the New Testament. The first is this one, philotimeomai, and it comes 3 times. Do you want to know what you should be ambitious for? Here are the 3 things. I make it my ambition to proclaim the good news. Make it your ambition to please him. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands. I think that's my favorite. I need that on my mirror every morning. Make it your ambition to lead a quiet life, to mind your own business, and to work with your hands. The other word that is translated ambition in the New Testament is erytheia. And this is a different kind of ambition. This means selfish ambition, working for personal gain and achievement. So the question is not, is it okay to be ambitious? But rather, what is the motivation for my ambition? There's always a yes, but when we try and paint a picture of what successful Christian living looks like. And that's hardly surprising. Because right at the crux, literally, of God's story is an event that looked very like the antithesis of success. God's greatest achievement, the single most successful thing that has ever happened in the entire history of humankind, the death of death, the defeat of sin, hell's destruction, and the opening of the gateway of life for all people for all time, looked very much like failure. It looked very much like one man, naked, ashamed, abandoned by his friends, hanging in agony on a wooden cross outside a city. Success and failure are close bedfellows in the story of God and his people. So I wonder if we need to begin to start thinking theologically about how we measure success and how we count it. In 1963, the sociologist William Bruce Cameron says this: "Not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted." No measurement is devoid of value, and what we count reveals what we think is important. We might paraphrase, "Where your graphs are, there your heart will be also." So I'd like very briefly, before you break again into groups to talk together, to suggest 3 good reasons for counting things and 3 bad reasons for counting things. So we're going to start with the bad reasons. Number 1, because numbers validate our existence. It's very easy to allow our identity to become caught up in the figures. It's possible for leaders to become infected with a very nasty disease called numeritis. That is a made-up word, by the way, before you Google it. Numeritis is a condition where you become obsessed with numbers. I've seen it happen in others, and I've caught cases of it myself. And so how do you know if you've got numeritis? Well, these symptoms are varied, but they might include the following. When there's been a church event that you weren't at, rather than asking how it went, you ask, how many people were there? When telling people about your numbers, how many in your church, what your giving figures are, you round it up by about 10% just to make it sound just a teensy bit better. When you constantly look over your shoulders to see what other people's numbers are like in comparison to your own. The trouble is that one of our major world leaders at the moment has a rather bad case of numeritis. I won't name him, but let's just refer to him as Ronald Bump. He became very upset when photographs revealed that the numbers at his predecessor's inauguration ceremony looked to be considerably more than his. When faced with the lowest electoral vote ever, he claimed it was because between 3 and 5 million people, always good to be accurate about these things, were in fact ineligible to vote and were bad dudes. Perhaps we do need to be concerned with numbers, but not obsessed with them. Which leads to the second bad reason for counting things, because we're anxious and afraid. It would be so easy to be frantic about making the graphs go in the right direction, anxious that this ship doesn't go down on our watch. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who lived through some of the most difficult times for the church, points out that there is no inevitable link between apparent growth and the health of the church. And it's quite a long quotation, but I'd like to read it to you now. I find this so encouraging. "It is not we who build. He wills to build the church. No man builds the church, but Christ alone. Whoever is minded to build the church is surely on the way to destroying it. For he will build a temple to idols without wishing or knowing it. We must confess, he builds. We must proclaim, he builds. We must pray to him, he builds. We do not know his plan. We cannot see whether he is building or pulling down. It may be that the times which by human standards are times of collapse are for him the great times of building. It may be that the times from which a human point of view are great times for the church are times when it is pulled down. It's a great comfort which Christ gives to his church. You confess, preach, bear witness to me, and I alone will build where it pleases me." Of course, Christ has no hands and feet on earth now except ours, and the honor and privilege of joining with him in building his kingdom is ours, but it's not a burden that we carry alone. And so to the third bad reason for counting things. because we think that by counting things, they'll automatically grow. My absolute favourite expression at the moment is weighing the pig doesn't fatten it. And in terms of weighing the pig of church growth, I sometimes wonder if we've even agreed what we're meant to be feeding the pig in the first place. One of the things I think to bear in mind is that counting and measuring are not the same things. Counting is about numbers and asks the question, how many or how often? Measuring looks at change, asking things like how far and how much. So when God made Adam and Eve, he told them both to be fruitful, a measuring thing, and to multiply, a counting thing, to fill the earth, a counting thing, and to subdue it, a measuring thing. Both measuring and counting are important, so you might want to talk about that when you're sat around your tables a bit later. So if those are bad reasons for counting things, what are some good reasons for counting things? Number one, God counts things. One of the ways that God's sovereignty is shown is in his authority to measure and count the things of the earth and its people. Who has measured the waters in the hollows of his hand and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? One of the marks of the people of God is that they will likewise measure things well. So you shall not cheat in measuring length or weight or quantity. You shan't round your numbers up by 10%. You shall have honest balances, honest weights, an honest ephah, and an honest hin. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Indeed, weighing and measuring things accurately is linked in the Bible to God's blessing. If you weigh and measure things honestly, the Lord God will let you enjoy a long life in the land he's giving you. And the reason for God's displeasure with false measuring is his concern, as you have in this diocese, for the poor and the outcast and the oppressed, who are the ones who most often lose out when things are not measured well. And that leads to the second good reason for measuring things. Numbers matter because people matter. Again, it's the motivation for our counting that's significant. In the Bible, counting people is a very dangerous activity, apparently. In 2 Samuel 24, King David tells his commander Joab to count the soldiers. And God gets really cross about it because he's been prompted by pride and selfish ambition and a failure to trust in God. And yet, several times in the Bible, God commands that a census is taken. Interestingly, the Hebrew word for to count when God commands it is the same word as to lift the head. To count people is really to see them, to lift their heads one by one. It's a gesture of love. At a recent visit to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial Center in Jerusalem, I was struck by the combination of the insistence on meticulously recording the numbers. There's a room where you can go where each number of Jewish people that was lost from each nation is listed, coupled with the careful remembering and telling of the stories of individuals with names, faces, and lives. The Hall of Names reflects the tireless work to document the stories of those who died. It's a powerful combination, and both are needed. A poll carried out this year by Opinion Matters for the Holocaust Memorial Day Trust shockingly revealed that 1 in 20 people still thinks the Holocaust did not happen. If we kept a moment's silence for every victim of the Holocaust, we would be silent for 11.5 years. These kinds of numbers matter because they tell a story. Counting shows us the scale of things we wish to celebrate, things we need to lament, and things we need to repent of and remember never to do again. And that leads to the third good reason for counting things. Counting helps us to know where we are. If we don't know where we are, we don't know where we're going. The leadership guru Max Dupre said this: the first responsibility of a leader is to define reality. The last is to say thank you. In between the two, the leader must become a servant. That sums up the progress of an artful leader. And defining reality inevitably will involve numbers and measurements. Being able to draw an honest picture of our context with clarity is an important factor in helping us to move forward. So before we spend some more time around tables and we talk about your own situations in relation to this, I'd like very briefly just to close by talking about two theological themes that might help us in our thinking. And these are two doctrines that make counting and measuring quite challenging for Christians. And the first is eschatology. The belief that at the end of time, Jesus will return. Now, in order to measure something, you need a time scale in which it happens. To know whether something has been done or not, you need an end date and a start date. By X time, we will have done Y. And to assess whether something's hit a target, you need a point at which that target is located. But the trouble is that God has no beginning and no end. We're part of a story that began before the foundation of time and will continue while endless ages run. One day, our work on earth will be done when Jesus is king, but he was insistent that about that day and hour, no one knows. Perhaps that's to stop us measuring things too much. We long for the coming of God's kingdom. And until then, we're in a constant state of yearning and longing for things to be better. Until that day when there is justice for the martyrs, until every tear is wiped from every eye, there is unfinished business, and you and I have a job to do. But we will always have a view that is much higher and deeper and longer than anything we actually see before us, because we believe in life after death and a kingdom that has no end. And so for Christians, all of our ambitions and our plans will have that constant sense of unfulfillment, because the work of God is never finished. The second doctrine that we might want to reflect on is this: amazing grace. Most measurements about success are about assessing how well something has been done and whether certain standards have been met. But at the heart of the Christian gospel is the countercultural claim that we can do nothing to save ourselves. No amount of effort on our part will lead to a greater salvation, which is God's gift. And life in Christ cannot be worked for. It can be worked at, but not worked for, but only received with open hands. And so in a world of performance review and measuring effectiveness, we remember that Jesus was the only person who ever performed anything effective, and Christians are assessed on the basis of his efforts alone. I love the way the Book of Common Prayer puts it. It's so final. By one oblation of himself once offered, a full, perfect, and sufficient sacrifice, oblation, and satisfaction for the sins of the whole world. And yet there is so much in business, in education, in the arts about whether such and such represents a good return for investment. The trouble is that not everything in God's kingdom can be measured this way. Is forgiveness effective? Is grace good value for money? Perhaps this concept of grace, the free gift of God, is something that our culture really needs to hear and rediscover in our performance-related anxiety. And so, as I close, I'd like to leave you with a short video clip of the rapper Stormzy at Glastonbury last year. And he leads a crowd of thousands upon thousands singing his song, Blinded by Your Grace. And just watch how people respond to this message. So there are some big questions to ask about how we understand ambition and success, how we weigh and measure outcomes for the kingdom, and what it might mean to be effective in what we do. And so I hope that as you have conversations together around your tables now, you will be able to reflect on some of these themes in your own contexts and ministries. And I hope you will be confident to be ambitious in the right ways, seeking growth and assessing it with the criteria of a God who has blinded us with his grace. Thank you.